Waterslide decals can be one of the longest parts of a build. When each decal requires you to cut it out, soak it, apply it, and then repeat the process one by one, it can really add up over time. Well, in today's video, I want to show you guys how you can cut that time down by more than half, and a bonus way where you can save money in the process. Let's get it. Alright, now that we're all set up to start a Waterslide decal tutorial, the first thing we're going to need is our decals. As you can see, it's all going to be on one sheet, just like any other Waterslide decal tutorial. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to cut it out. The reason we have a cutting mat is to protect our cutting surface. You can cut directly on the desk. I don't advise it. In order to cut it out, we're going to need a hobby knife. So we'll get these things and we'll put them off to the side for now to talk about the actual water slide part of it. First thing you're going to need is a tray to dip your decals in, and we're going to fill it up with water. If you've seen my Waterslide decal tutorial, you know I like a soap dish, and the reason being is that for the larger decals like these long ones here, I know that the entire thing will sit inside the soap dish evenly. I know that when this side is wet and it's ready to go, I know this side is going to be ready to go, so I can slide it off in one go and not have to worry about one side being ready but this side still being stuck. Bigger soap dish is going to be great for those larger decals, but if you don't have anything larger, let's say you're working on a real grade and you have small ones, you don't need something this big, but I still highly recommend it if you're working on master grades or anything bigger than that. Next thing we're going to need is something to move our decals around with, and a lot of times people like to use a toothpick, but I actually like to use a meat skewer. Reason being is that when you're using a toothpick, normally it's not long enough to reach all the way to the side of your hand over here, so you end up having to pinch the toothpick like this in order to do a lot of work. Now, for long periods of time, that's going to start to get a little bit tense. You might start to cramp a little bit, which is why I prefer the meat skewer, because I can rest it on my hand like this and still be able to move it without really using too much tension in my hands. And if I really need to get really fine details, I can choke up and still keep a very relaxed grip compared to something like this in order to do small movements. I can relax my hand a little bit, use the counterweight of the extra length, rest it on my hand, and I can still do really tiny, small movements just like that. The meat skewer is going to be perfect for those kind of really tight movements. It's going to be a lot more comfortable than a toothpick. Next, as you can see here, we're going to need a cotton bud. This is going to be to help us once we're done placing our decal. We're going to roll out the moisture. I prefer these smaller cotton buds. This is the one that I have here. I got it from a local Longs or CVS pharmacy. I prefer these because they're a little bit of a tighter wind, and so I can actually roll the water out of the decal as opposed to just kind of, if I touch it with a larger one, sometimes it'll pull up some of that water and it might pull the decal off the piece. So I prefer these tighter winds because it doesn't pull up as much water. I end up using a little bit more, but then that way I can make sure that when I roll this decal out, I know it's going to stay where I want it to stay. Now for this tutorial, what's going to help me speed up the process is actually going to be a wet palette. Now, for those of you who are my mini painters, you know what a wet palette is, but for those of you who may not be familiar with, a wet palette is basically going to be a tray like this that's going to have a sponge in the middle. Now this sponge is going to be filled with water, and if you look at it and if I press down, you can see some of the water kind of come up around my fingers as I press down. And what that's going to do is when we dip our decals in water, let's say either in our soap dish or even in a little section like here, we're going to put it on this sponge, and what's going to happen is as the decal sits, it's going to start to dry out. But as it dries, it's going to pull moisture up from the sponge into the decal, keeping it moist, and meaning it'll stay ready to go longer before needing to be re-dipped. How this is going to speed up the process is that I can dip 3, 4, 5 decals, put it on the sponge, work on one, adjust it, throw that away, pull up the next one. I don't have to dip it and wait anymore. I can just pull the next one, go straight to the next decal, and so on and so forth. Now you're not working with one decal at a time, you're working with 4 or 5 decals at a time, which means you can knock out an entire piece in one sitting. Let's go ahead, get the camera set up for that, and we'll go ahead and get started. So now before we can get started, we need to prepare our wet palette. As you can kind of see here, the sponge has a little bit of moisture in it, but it's not where we need it to be. To know if your sponge is ready for waterslide decals, what you want to do is you want to add just enough water to the point where the sponge can't hold anymore, and you start to see some water pool up around the edges. Now, this is not quite enough to where I want it to be, so let's just add a little bit more. As you can see, it's soaking in, and as I pour it to the edges, you can see the water kind of pooling up there. So now I know that the sponge is at its maximum saturation. It can't hold any more water. That's where we want it to be. Next, we're going to go ahead and add some water here to this tray. This is what I'm going to be using to dip my waterslide decals in, and then I'll go ahead and rest it here on the sponge. And the piece we're going to be using today is going to be the upper airfoil of the Force Impulse kit. We're going to finish that up today. So I'm gonna go ahead and take some of these decals and I'm gonna cut them out, and I'll kind of walk you guys through what you can do in order to get these decals dipped, set on the sponge, and I'll show you how you guys can kind of really save a lot of time doing your decals this way. Alright, so now that we have all of our decals cut out, I just wanted to kind of show you how tiny these things really are, which is why I didn't really need to use the larger cup. But if you need to for bigger decals, you can. But I just wanted to show you guys, I have an assortment of different decals here that are going to go on the upper airfoil. So let's go ahead, back the camera out, and I'll dip them and get them onto our sponge so you can kind of see the process and how it goes. Alright, so here we go. All I'm going to do is I'll get my decals. I'm just going to dip it in the water and put it on the sponge, and I'm just going to leave it like that there, and go ahead and just do the same thing with the next one. Just dip it, leave it on the sponge. Oh, let's make sure the entire thing gets wet first before we leave it on the sponge. If you look at the decal and it doesn't look like the entire surface of it got wet because maybe surface tension or air got trapped in it, always just give it a second dip if you need to, and just lay it on your sponge. But what's happening is as the decal is drying, it's pulling up moisture from the sponge underneath. And that's what's keeping the decal moist without letting the decal float up and off of the paper. That's kind of the most important thing, which is why you don't leave your decals just sitting in water. Because if left for a long period of time, if the decal is disturbed, it can cause it to just kind of peel up off the backing and just kind of float up to the surface, making it harder to get a good hold on it, to be able to kind of place it nicely on your piece. So just go ahead, dip, place your decal on the sponge, let it sit, and just continue on until you get all of the pieces that you want to get done, dipped and ready to go. Again, the idea of doing it this way helps you get all of your decals prepared, so you're not stopping and doing one decal where you cut it out, dip it, wait, apply it, cut it out, dip it, wait, apply it. You cut out a bunch, you dip a bunch, and then you apply a bunch at the same time. The idea is kind of just like streamlining the process where you're doing more of the same thing at once to cut down on the constant time of going back and forth between the steps. So now if we go back to the first decal, as you can see, this decal is ready to go, even though all we did was dip it once and then leave it on the sponge to dry. And if we check some of the other ones, this one's ready to go, this one's ready to go, and we'll go ahead and leave these as is. And I'm just going to zoom the camera back out to just show you how easy it really is to just kind of do this whole thing all in one go. So one of the other cool things about cutting out your decals like this is that when you have all your decals ready to go and you know exactly which ones you want to place, if you end up with any extra ones like this here, you can always go back and double check your work. Now, looking on this side, I have all my decals here, but I realized I missed putting one up here. So having that little bit of extra buffer to make sure you don't forget any of your decals is also a great way to help keep track of what decals you have placed where and making sure that you know that you haven't missed any like I just did right here. So let's say maybe you're shopping everywhere and this thing is out of stock, or maybe money is tight, but you still want to be able to take advantage of the techniques or the tips that I'm giving you today. Well, bonus tip for you guys today is to how to make one of these at home for yourself. Now, I'm going to go ahead and set this aside, and I'm going to show you the two things that you need to make your own at-home wet palette. Now, first thing is obviously going to be a container. So that's going to be any sort of Tupperware container that you can find around the house. All you really need is just something to store the sponge part of it in, so we can keep it nice and moist and we can keep it covered for when we're not using it. Speaking of the sponge, the one you're going to try to look for is something like this. This is called a cellulose sponge or a Swedish dishcloth. If you can, try to find one that's not going to have a texture on this side. If I flip it over, you see this one has a diamond pattern on it. This is the side that's going to be face down. I want this flat side to be face up because when it gets wet, it's going to lay nice and flat and even for our decals to sit on. All you're going to want to do is just cut it out. here. I'm only making it round so it looks a little bit nicer in the container. But you want it to sit just like that in the middle here. If you want, you can give yourself a little bit of leeway in the corners here or on the edges. But basically, that's all you need. Go ahead and fill this up with water. And now you have your at-home wet palette. Couple things before we wrap up today. Number one, if your sponge isn't laying flat or it has a little bit of a texture to it, try adding some warm water as opposed to cold water to help the sponge relax a little bit and lay flat. Number two, make sure you protect your decal work with a top coat. You can use whatever glossy or flat top coat that you want to get the desired finish on your kit. Lastly, if you have any questions or concerns, please drop them down in the comments below and let me know what you thought of this video. With that said, guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found some value in this video, and remember, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'll see you in the next one.